600 years ago, before the sun touched the hills of England, France, or the Low Countries, a man woke up hungry. Not hungry in the way we use that word today, not "I could eat" hungry. Hungry in a way that shaped his entire day, his entire year, his entire life. He did not know if there would be enough. He did not know if the rains that fell last autumn had been kind to the wheat or cruel. He did not know if winter would end with his children thinner than they began it. And yet, and this is the part almost nobody tells you, he was not starving, not most days, not most years. He was something else entirely. A man living on one of the most misunderstood diets in human history. For centuries, we have pictured the medieval peasant eating like a beggar. Gray gruel, rotten meat, maybe a turnip if he was lucky. Hollywood gave us muddy stew bowls and toothless men gnawing on bones in candlelit halls. But strip away the myth, and something stranger emerges. Something backed not by guesswork, but by tax rolls, monastery records, frozen bones pulled from churchyard soil, and the teeth of the dead. Teeth that, it turns out, remember everything. What if the food on a poor farmer's table in the year 1300 was in some ways healthier than what sits on yours tonight? What if the bread he ate, the bread historians once dismissed as peasant filler, held nutrients that vanished from our diets centuries ago? And what if the single greatest tragedy in medieval history, a plague that would kill nearly half of Europe, also became the best thing that ever happened to their dinner table? This is the story of what medieval farmers really ate. Not the myth, the evidence. And by the end, you may never look at a loaf of bread the same way again. To understand what a medieval farmer ate, you first have to understand where he stood, quite literally, in the world around him. Most of Europe in the High Middle Ages, roughly the 11th through the 14th centuries, ran on a system historians called manorialism. Land was not something a farmer simply owned and worked for himself. It belonged, in a legal and almost spiritual sense, to a lord, sometimes a knight, sometimes a monastery, sometimes a baron who had never set foot on the property at all. The farmer, in most cases, was a peasant, and within that single word hid an entire spectrum of lives. Some were free tenants, paying rent in coin or produce, able to leave if they chose. Many more were serfs, bound to the land, owing labor to their lord for a set number of days each week in exchange for the right to farm a strip of soil for themselves. And it was on that strip, usually no more than a few scattered acres, broken into long, thin parcels, mixed in among the holdings of his neighbors, that a farmer grew almost everything that would end up on his table. This detail matters more than it seems. A medieval farmer was not choosing his diet the way we choose ours. He was not standing in front of shelves. His plate was decided months in advance, by weather, by soil, by the strength of his ox, and by how much of his harvest the Lord's bailiff would take before the rest was even brought home. And so, before we can talk about what was eaten, we have to talk about what was grown. Because in the medieval world, the field and the dinner table were almost the same place. If there is one food that defined the medieval world more than any other, it was not meat, it was not cheese, it was grain, and specifically the bread, porridge, and ale made from it. Historians estimate that for most peasants, grain products supplied somewhere between 70 and 80% of daily calories. Everything else, vegetables, dairy, the occasional scrap of meat, orbited around this central, unglamorous fact. Bread was life, and life depended on the harvest. But here's where the popular imagination gets it wrong almost immediately. We picture medieval bread as one thing, a single gray, heavy loaf. In reality, bread in the Middle Ages was a hierarchy, almost a visible class system baked into every household. At the top sat wheat,
specifically the finest sieved white flour used to bake what was called pandemain or manchet bread. This was the bread of lords, bishops, and wealthy merchants. It was soft, pale, and prestigious, and most ordinary farmers rarely tasted it, except perhaps once a year at a feast, or never at all. Far more common on a peasant's own table were the lesser grains, rye, barley, and oats, often mixed together into something called maslin, a blended flour that stretched a harvest further and tolerated poorer soil and harsher weather better than wheat ever could. Rye, in particular, thrived in the cold, wet conditions of much of northern Europe, where wheat would simply fail. Barley, meanwhile, served double duty, baked into dense, dark loaves, but just as often boiled into pottage or malted to brew the single most important drink in the medieval world, which we will return to shortly. And then there was the bread almost no documentary mentions, horse bread, made from peas, beans, and bran, the leftover husks of milled grain. This coarse, heavy loaf was in hard years what the poorest farmers and laborers actually ate, alongside the animals it was technically named for. It was filling, it was cheap, it was, by every account we have, not particularly pleasant, but it kept people alive. This is the first thing the myths get wrong. There was no single medieval peasant bread. There was a ladder of bread, rung by rung, and where you stood on that ladder told you almost everything about your place in medieval society, long before anyone asked your name. But bread, as essential as it was only the beginning of the meal, because every single day, in nearly every peasant household across medieval Europe, something else was happening, something simmering quietly over the fire from morning till night, something that more than any other dish was the true daily food of the Middle Ages.
If bread was the foundation of the medieval diet, pottage was its heartbeat. Picture a thick, often slow-cooked stew, sometimes more like a porridge, sometimes closer to a soup, that simmered nearly continuously in a single pot over the household fire. Vegetables went in, grains went in, whatever scraps the day provided went in, and the pot was rarely, if ever, fully emptied and started fresh. Instead, it was topped up day after day, a slowly evolving dish that some households kept going in some form for weeks at a time. What went into that pot depended almost entirely on the season and what the garden, usually a small plot attached to the cottage called a toft, was producing. Cabbage was a staple, along with leeks, onions, garlic, and a variety of leafy greens that we would barely recognize today, since many of our modern vegetable varieties didn't exist yet in their current form. Peas and beans, dried and stored from the previous summer, added crucial protein, especially through the long winter months when fresh produce disappeared entirely. Herbs mattered more than people assume, not for the delicate flavoring we associate with fine cooking today, but for practical, almost medicinal reasons. Parsley, sage, thyme, and dill grew in nearly every cottage garden, used to season the otherwise plain pottage and, in the medieval understanding of medicine, to balance the body's internal humors. Food and health were not separate categories in the medieval mind. What you ate was, quite literally, what kept you in balance. Notice what is conspicuously almost entirely absent from this list: meat. And this brings us to one of the most persistent myths about medieval life, the image of peasants gnawing on turkey legs and roasted boar, a fantasy borrowed more from later royal banquets and modern fantasy films than from any real historical record. For the overwhelming majority of medieval farmers, meat was not a daily food, it was a special one. This single pot, then, humble, repetitive, endlessly reheated, was where most medieval calories, vitamins, and a great deal of fiber actually came from. It was unglamorous. It was, by modern standards, monotonous to the point of exhausting. But it was also, as we will see later, surprisingly balanced, far more so than the myths of medieval slop would have you believe.
And no meal, no pottage, no loaf of bread was complete without something to wash it down. Something that in the medieval world was consumed not as a luxury, but as a matter of basic survival. Here's a fact that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Medieval farmers, including children, drank ale, what historians often call small beer or small ale, as their everyday beverage, often multiple times a day. This was not, as is sometimes assumed, because medieval water was universally filthy and dangerous, nor was it because everyone was perpetually drunk. The reality is more nuanced and more interesting. Water quality varied enormously depending on the source. A clean well in the countryside might be perfectly safe, while water drawn near a crowded town or downstream from livestock was a genuine health risk. Ale, brewed from barley or oats and only lightly fermented, offered something water couldn't always guarantee. The boiling process involved in brewing killed many harmful pathogens, and the low alcohol content, often far weaker than modern beer, helped prevent spoilage during storage. It was, in effect, a safer, more stable, calorie-dense alternative to water, brewed fresh in many households on a weekly basis. And brewing itself was almost always women's work, a fact too often left out of the story. Across medieval Europe, it was frequently the farmer's wife or a professional brewster in the village who produced the household's ale, turning surplus or substandard grain into a drink that fed the whole family calories they desperately needed, especially during the heaviest months of physical labor. Small ale was weak enough that drinking it throughout the day did not leave farmers stumbling through their fields, though stronger ale, brewed for festivals or sold in village alehouses, certainly existed and certainly was capable of doing exactly that. In wine-growing regions of France, Italy, and parts of Germany, watered-down wine served a similar daily purpose. In Britain, particularly the further north and west you traveled, cider made from apples and pears filled the same role in areas where orchards thrived. So the next time you imagine a medieval peasant's table, picture this: bread in one hand, a cup of weak ale in the other, and a pot of pottage between them, fueling some of the hardest physical labor in human history. But there was one force that could override all of this, that could empty the pot, change the bread, and forbid the very meat that occasionally graced the table. And it didn't come from the fields, it came from the church. In the medieval world, the Christian calendar did not simply mark holy days, it governed diet, directly, specifically, and with real consequences for what landed in the pottage pot. By the estimates of religious historians, observant Christians in medieval Europe were expected to abstain from meat on a remarkable number of days each year. Every Friday, in commemoration of the crucifixion, often Wednesdays and Saturdays as well, the entire 40 days of Lent leading up to Easter, and additional fasting periods tied to Advent and various holy days. When added together, these restrictions could cover close to a third of the calendar year. On these fasting days, meat was forbidden, but fish was not, and this single rule reshaped the medieval economy in ways still visible today. Fish ponds became common features of monasteries and manors. Herring, often salted and barreled for transport, became one of the most important traded foods in medieval Europe, particularly in coastal regions of England, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia. Inland, where fresh sea fish was harder to come by, freshwater fish like eel, pike, and trout filled the same role, along with shellfish wherever rivers and coasts allowed. For poorer farmers far from the sea, fasting sometimes meant simply eating more bread, pottage, and dairy, and going without the small amounts of meat they might otherwise have had. The church's rules pressed down on rich and poor alike, but the burden, as it often did, fell heaviest on those with the least to give up in the first place. This is also where dairy and eggs earn their quiet but crucial place in the medieval diet. Cheese, made to preserve milk far longer than it would last fresh, became a staple protein source, especially on fasting days when meat was off the table. Eggs, cheap, plentiful when hens were laying and acceptable under most fasting rules, filled gaps that meat could not. Butter, too, served both as food and, in parts of Northern Europe, almost as a form of currency, traded and rendered to peasants and lords alike. The rhythm of the medieval table, then, was never simply about hunger or harvest. It pulsed in time with the church bells, a calendar of restriction and release that shaped what filled the pot just as powerfully as the seasons themselves.
When meat did appear on a medieval farmer's table, it was almost never the great roasted joints of fantasy banquets. Far more often, it came from animals the household itself had raised and could not afford to lose carelessly. A chicken too old to lay well, a pig fattened over the autumn on scraps and forest mast, acorns and beech nuts gathered from common woodland and slaughtered as winter approached, its meat salted, smoked, or preserved in fat to stretch across the cold months ahead. Pork, in fact, was probably the single most common meat among medieval farmers, precisely because pigs were efficient, low maintenance, and could be raised on land and scraps unsuitable for growing crops. The annual autumn slaughter, sometimes called Martinmas after the November feast day it was often timed around, was a major event in the farming calendar. Not a celebration of abundance, but a careful, practical act of preservation, turning one valuable animal into bacon, sausage, and salted joints meant to last through the leanest part of the year. Beef and mutton existed too, but cattle and sheep were frequently more valuable alive than dead, providing milk, wool, manure for the fields, and labor pulling plows, meaning they were far more likely to be sold, traded, or kept working than slaughtered for a single family's table. When an older or injured animal was finally killed, its meat, often tough and stringy by modern standards, was used carefully with nothing wasted. Bones for broth, fat rendered and stored, offal eaten rather than discarded. And here lies one of the sharpest, often unspoken injustices of the medieval countryside. Wild game, deer, boar, hare in many regions, was almost entirely off-limits to ordinary farmers. Forest laws, particularly strict across much of England and France, reserved hunting rights for the nobility, and poaching could carry severe punishment, sometimes including the loss of a hand or worse, depending on the era, region, and severity of the offense. The forests a peasant walked past every day, full of meat he could see and sometimes even smell, roasting from a lord's hunting party, were, in a very real legal sense, not his to touch. So when we say medieval farmers rarely ate meat, we don't mean rarely as in occasionally less. We mean it as a defining feature of their entire diet. A few times a week for moderately prosperous peasants, perhaps a handful of times a month, or only at major feasts for the poorest cottagers. Protein for most medieval families came not from meat at all, but from peas, beans, cheese, and eggs, the quiet, unglamorous backbone of the daily diet. But all of this, the bread, the pottage, the ale, the rare meat, assumed something the medieval farmer could never fully count on: a good harvest. And when the harvest failed, everything described so far could vanish within a single season. There's a phrase historians use for a specific stretch of the medieval calendar, and it is worth sitting with for a moment: the hungry gap. It fell roughly between late winter and early summer, after the previous year's stored grain, vegetables, and salted meat had been steadily consumed, and before the new harvest had ripened enough to bring fresh relief. For weeks, sometimes a month or more, families lived on dwindling reserves, stretching the last of the grain, the final strips of dried meat, whatever hardy greens could be coaxed from the cold ground. In good years, the hungry gap meant simply tightening the belt, smaller portions, thinner pottage, bread stretched with more bran and less grain. In bad years, it meant something far darker. Medieval Europe was no stranger to genuine famine, and the most devastating example of all struck in the early 1300s, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, triggered by a catastrophic run of cold, relentlessly wet weather across northern Europe that drowned crops in the field and rotted grain in storage 2 years running. Contemporary chronicles from the period describe scenes almost too grim to fully absorb. Desperate people eating the flesh of horses and dogs, parents unable to feed their children, and widespread reports, impossible to verify with certainty, but consistent across multiple independent sources, of extreme deprivation, pushing some communities to the very edge of what a starving population might resort to. Historians estimate the famine killed somewhere between 5 and 12% of the population across the affected regions in just a few years, a staggering toll, predating the Black Death by roughly 30 decades, and one too often overshadowed by the plague that would follow. This is the side of the medieval diet that no recipe collection or reenactment village can fully capture. The constant, underlying anxiety of a system with almost no margin for error. One bad harvest meant hardship, 2 bad harvests in a row, as in 1315 to 1317, meant mass death. The pottage pot, the loaf of bread, the cup of ale, all of it rested on a foundation as fragile as the weather itself. And yet, somehow, we know an extraordinary amount about exactly what these people ate, down to surprisingly precise detail. Not because medieval farmers kept diaries about their dinners, but because of something far stranger, the evidence they left without ever meaning to. For centuries, almost everything we thought we knew about medieval peasant diet came from indirect sources, manorial account rolls listing what grain was harvested and how much was owed in rent, monastery records tracking food given to laborers during harvest work, court records mentioning food in passing during unrelated disputes. These documents are invaluable, but they describe what was grown and distributed, not necessarily what individual people actually ate, in what quantities, over a lifetime. The real breakthrough came from an unlikely source: bones and teeth. Modern bioarchaeology can analyze the chemical signatures left behind in human skeletal remains, a technique called stable isotope analysis, to reconstruct, with remarkable precision, the broad outlines of what a person ate across years or even decades of their life. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes absorbed from food, embedded permanently in bone and tooth enamel as they form, reveal whether a diet leaned heavily on plants or included significant marine protein, whether someone consumed substantial meat or relied mostly on grains and legumes, and crucially, real measurable differences between social classes, with skeletons from wealthier urban or monastic burials sometimes showing notably higher animal protein consumption than those from poorer rural parish cemeteries. Teeth tell their own vivid story. Dental wear patterns from medieval skeletons frequently show heavy, even grinding consistent with coarse, fibrous, grain-based diets, and a particular, very specific kind of damage that surprises many people. Stone-ground flour, even if sieved carefully, almost always contain tiny fragments of grit from the millstones themselves. Over a lifetime of eating bread made from this flour, that grit wore down tooth enamel in a measurable, characteristic pattern, still visible in skeletons exhumated today, nearly 1,000 years later. This is the quiet power of bioarchaeology. It does not need a farmer to have written down what he ate. His own body did the writing, sealed into bone and enamel, waiting centuries to be read. But the most surprising chapter in this entire story isn't found in what medieval farmers ate during ordinary years at all. It's found in what happened to their diet after the single greatest catastrophe in medieval history, an event that paradoxically made life at the table noticeably better for those who survived it.
In 1347, a disease, later known as the Black Death, arrived in Europe.
and over the following years, it tore through the continent with a speed and lethality almost impossible to comprehend even now. Estimates vary by region, but historians generally agree the plague killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population within just a few devastating years. Villages were emptied, entire households vanished. The world the medieval farmer had known, overcrowded, land-hungry, with too many mouths competing for too few fields, was, in the span of a single generation, violently and irrevocably transformed. And then something happened that historians still consider one of the most striking economic and dietary turning points in medieval history. With so much of the population dead, labor suddenly became scarce, and scarce labor in any economy becomes valuable labor. Surviving peasants found themselves in a position their grandparents could never have imagined. Lords, desperate for workers to till their fields, began offering higher wages, better terms, and greater freedoms to attract and keep the laborers who remained. At the very same time, with far fewer people left to feed, there was suddenly more food available per surviving person. Land previously farmed intensively for grain out of sheer population pressure was increasingly turned over to pasture, since raising livestock required far less labor than growing crops, and labor was now the scarcest resource of all. More pasture meant more cattle and sheep. More livestock meant, for the first time in generations, significantly more meat and dairy reaching ordinary tables, not as an occasional luxury, but with growing, noticeable regularity. Manorial and wage records from the decades following the plague consistently show real wages rising and meat consumption increasing among the surviving peasantry across much of Western Europe, a trend detectable in skeletal isotope studies as well, which show measurable upticks in animal protein consumption in populations dated to the period after 1350 compared to those buried before the plague struck. This is, without question, one of history's most uncomfortable truths. The worst demographic catastrophe medieval Europe ever experienced directly produced for those who lived through it a measurably better, more varied, more secure diet than their parents and grandparents had known. Tragedy and improvement woven together so tightly that historians cannot fully separate one from the other. The Black Death did not simply take lives, it quietly, brutally rewrote what was left on the table for everyone who survived it. And yet, even in the hardest years before the plague, even amid hunger gaps and fasting days, and grain ground down to the last grit-filled handful, medieval farmers found moments, scattered, deliberate, fiercely protected, where the table became something more than survival, something closer to joy. Harvest time, for all its exhausting physical labor, also carried with it one of the few genuine celebrations woven into the agricultural calendar, the harvest feast, often held at the close of the grain harvest, sometimes funded in part by the Lord of the Manor himself, who understood, whether out of generosity, tradition, or simple practicality, that workers who had just brought in the year's most critical crop deserved and needed a moment of real reward. These feasts, recorded in manorial accounts that occasionally itemize exactly what was purchased for the occasion, could include foods rarely seen on an ordinary day. Fresh meat in genuinely substantial portions, stronger ale brewed specifically for the event, white bread instead of the usual coarse maslin loaf, even small amounts of imported spices or dried fruit in wealthier households. For one evening, the rigid hierarchy of the medieval table softened, if only slightly. Religious feast days, too, Christmas, Easter, the village's own patron saint's day, punctuated the long stretches of restriction and monotony with sanctioned indulgence. After 40 days of Lenten fasting, an Easter meal featuring eggs, meat, and rich dairy was not simply food. It was, in a very real sense, a community-wide exhale, a release valve built directly into the rhythm of medieval life. It would be a mistake to romanticize this too far.
These feasts were rare punctuation marks in lives defined far more by labor and scarcity than by celebration. But it would be an equal mistake to overlook them entirely, because they reveal something essential about how medieval farmers related to food, not merely as fuel to survive the next day's labor, but as something worth gathering for, worth celebrating, worth protecting fiercely on the rare occasions it was abundant. In the end, the table of a medieval farmer was never just about hunger. It was a map of an entire society, written in grain, in ale, in salted pork hung from smoky rafters, in the silence of a fasting day and the noise of a harvest feast. Every bite carried the weight of weather, of law, of religion, of class, of survival itself. So what did medieval farmers really eat? Bread, more often coarse and dark than soft and white. A pot of vegetables and grain, simmering for days at a time. Weak ale instead of water. Cheese and eggs far more often than meat. Fish on a third of the year's days by religious decree. And threaded through all of it, a constant, quiet vulnerability to the weather, to the calendar, to forces entirely beyond their control. It was not a diet of luxury, but neither was it the grim, monochrome gruel of popular myth. It was, by the measure of modern nutritional science, often surprisingly high in fiber, low in refined sugar, built around whole grains and legumes that nutritionists today actively encourage us to eat more of, paired, undeniably, with real and sometimes devastating risks of seasonal scarcity that most of us in the modern world will never have to face. Perhaps that is the real lesson hidden in the bones and bread of the medieval table, that for all our distance from that world, our refrigerators, our supermarkets, our certainty that dinner will simply appear, we are separated from real structural hunger by a thinner margin of history than we often like to admit. The medieval farmer did not choose monotony or fasting or the hungry gap. He endured them season after season, harvest after harvest, and built around them a diet that, however plain, kept an entire civilization standing. The next time you tear into a piece of bread, consider this. Somewhere in a quiet churchyard in England or France or the Low Countries lie the remains of people whose teeth still carry the grit of the very stones that ground their flour. Silent witnesses to lives built meal by meal, harvest by harvest, on the same grain that, in some form, still feeds us today.